which brings me to probably the most controversial thing I've ever heard you say, which is you argued quite eloquently
Oh, right.
that the quote unquote first miracle of Jesus
Yeah.
was probably turning water into white wine.
Yeah.
Which kind of has to do with stored wine versus the white wine. So maybe you could explain. I don't want you to give away everything in this book, but this to me is like, oh, this matters.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
It kind of pulls together lots of things you've been saying about craftsmanship and taste and flavor
Mm,
and storage and all those things. So
totally.
why do you argue white wine as the miracle, not red wine?
Yes. So there's a couple of things to keep in mind. So the first thing, the master of the banquet, and when he tastes the wine, he says, normally you bring out the good stuff, and then once everyone's had their fill, as the English euphemistically is often rendered, but it's once they're drunk,
Mm.
then you bring out the lesser, right? You won't care about the quality of the wine anymore. Your taste buds are shot, like whatever is implied there. And we have other kind of references in antiquity about these types of dining customs of doing this very thing. But he says, but you've kept the good stuff for now. And yeah, that speaks to, or at least raises a question of well, what did ancient people think was good?
Right.
And when you dig into some of the agricultural writers like Pliny the Elder or Columella or figures like this, they'll often talk about how some wines are good because you don't get a headache from them, right?
Mm.
Sometimes what makes a wine good is it doesn't harm you as much, and there's different ways of thinking about what makes for good wine. But what's really interesting, the wines that are prized in the Bible, there's provenance associated with it, whether it's like Lebanon in particular.
Mm.
It's one of the only places where provenance is mentioned other than Helbon in Ezekiel 27. And maybe Sorek, but that's the choice vine, that may or may not reflect provenance. But yeah, you don't really get a lot of specifics in the Bible about what makes something particularly good. There's references to how it's it is good or it is better or whatever, but the idea that knowing specifically what's in view is not terribly obvious. Again, going back to these agricultural writers, when they talk about the best wines, in Rome, they'll talk about certain producers, and they talk about place over product a lot.
Mm.
Certain places make really good wine, and there's the kind of the best wine is Falernum, and Pliny has a lot to say about this. And it seems like Falernum was probably a white wine, and there's a handful of places where white wine is really highly prized. A great example, probably my favorite example, is this wine shop in Herculaneum, which
Mm.
was destroyed by Mount Vesuvius along with Pompeii, and very well preserved, although destroyed, but in this amazing level of preservation. There are these wines that are sort of on the storefront, sort of like fresco painting, and you've got four different colors of the wines, and the most expensive one is the white one.
Mm.
And so you have these different dynamics, and part of the reason why white wine would be highly prized is because it was harder to make. I mean, it basically involves no maceration, so no skin contact. As a result, probably most white wines were technically orange or amber, but
Mm.
the idea of getting something white would mean no maceration, so no skin contact. You're intentionally doing that, but
Wait, how do you get the juice out with no skin contact?
So at whatever point when they're trampling or whatever, they would have there would have been same situation with the vat where the wine's going to flow
Right.
into the vat, but they would have just prevented the skins from going into the
Okay,
vat
so there's
as
a
well.
heavy straining mechanism. Yeah.
Yes, something like that. But the idea is that this is going to be difficult, and it also means that you are removing the source of fermentation from the process because the skins have yeast on them. So that's another thing that amps up the difficulty. You know, the yeast could still be in the juice, and whatever vats the juice is being fermented in, oftentimes yeast resides in the places where, like on the equipment at breweries and wineries and all this stuff. It just is, because it's been used there, it's sort of still there. So that probably would ameliorate some of the concern about whether they could continue to produce it. But white wine was highly prized. It was difficult to make, more difficult than other wines, more steps involved, and it's more precarious. So one way to think about that, then, like this reference to good wine, is like, well, we have these references to white wine being highly prized and all this stuff. Could it be that, in making good wine, Jesus made a wine that would have been, well regarded and would have been viewed as maybe even more miraculous? I mean, wine in general is going to be miraculous, but white wine, if it's harder to make, that could speak to the significance of this sign perhaps a little bit more. But the last thing I'll say is that if you read the text closely, it never says anything visual about this miracle. There's no comment about how they noticed, the wine, or they except in tasting. It's in the tasting that this sign is recognized. It's not in anything visual. And what I always find very, very fun is when you look at like children's Bibles, you look at any kind of illustration of this scene, films, Jesus films, it's always red wine. And one of my favorite examples is this Mexican film, Reina de Reinas. It's about the Virgin Mary, and it is such a visual miracle that there's no tasting involved at all. Literally, after they poured the water in, they scoop up and pour it back into the vessel, and it's clearly dark. It's a black and white film. It's clearly dark, so you can see that the miracle has happened. And the master of the banquet, without tasting it, just looks at everybody and says, "You've kept the good wine until now," which is amazing, because it just hammers home the idea that people imagine that this was a miracle that you could see and respect, and you didn't have to taste it to realize that a miracle had taken place. And so that the fact that there's nothing visual about the miracle also leads me to think that the water probably looked like the wine. And so that's the kind of the last point. So when we take all those factors together, I think it's we don't know what Jesus made, but there's good reasons to think that it could have been white wine. And I think that is a fascinating point to make, given that wine connoisseurs today are so big on red wines especially. And it just shows, if this point is at all on the right track, it just shows one additional way in which comparing ancient wine and modern wine, there's a lot of things to consider. There's different palates that we're talking about. There's different processes. There's different products. But then we also, this is I think even more significant, we perceive wine differently. We're talking about the wedding at Cana, and we're talking about how this was a miracle. I think we have to keep in mind that wine in general is miraculous.
Right.
They don't know what's happening, right? They just know if you break up the grapes, bust them open, it's going to turn into alcohol. They're not going to articulate it that way, the concept of alcohol, but like they just know that you're going to get some kind of crazy potent drink as a result of this. And so there's a lot of myths about like, how did we get alcohol? Where does alcohol come from? In different cultures. And I think it speaks to, again, there's a difference of perception. wine in general is miraculous. So we're talking about the wedding at Cana being a miraculous wine event, but really the whole Bible is full of miraculous references to wine that I think we have to keep in mind. This is just the most significant wine miracle, but it's all sort of divine activity, if you like.